French President Emmanuel Macron has urged his Russian counterpart to Vladimir Putin to work towards averting war with the Ukraine. Macron is the first senior European leader to hold direct talks with the Kremlin aimed at easing tensions with Kyiv. Putin, for his part, says Russia and France shared a common concern about what is happening in the security sphere in Europe. US officials say the Kremlin has assembled over 100,000 troops along the border with its pro-Western neighbor. But intelligence assessments have not determined whether Putin has actually decided to invade. They say Russia is on track to amass a large enough force for a full-scale invasion by mid-February. However, Moscow has denied the claim it's planning to invade the Ukraine. Russia is seeking a guarantee from NATO that the Ukraine will not enter the alliance and wants the bloc to withdraw forces from member states in Eastern Europe. All right, to talk a little bit more about this, we're joined by Petro Burkovskiy, a senior fellow at the Kyiv-based Democratic Initiatives Foundation. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps let's start with the talks between the French and Russian presidents. In the past couple of days or weeks or so, it's been almost hinted that the Russian president is likely to get a more sympathetic enough ear from the French president. Your thoughts on this?
First, we have to understand that French politicians and the French diplomats, they are very practical people. And because of these practical calculations, they support stable relations and beneficial relations with Russia. However, at the same time, France is a nuclear power. France is a very important European power, and France has very close relations with Germany, with the United States. France is a part of North Atlantic Treaty Organization of NATO. And right now, what the French president is trying to do is he's trying to convince the Russian president that the game he's playing right now would not bring him results. That the threats that Russia is using against Europe, against all European countries, against Eastern NATO members and against Ukraine will not give the results the Russia desired. And another important thing for us to understand right now is that if you look closely, you will see that Russia is meeting only leaders of the countries which are nuclear powers or which are very, very important economic partners. So like the United States, like China, and right now we have France. And the French leader is going to use these relations with Russia, important relations with Russia, in order to persuade Putin that in the 21st century, the threat of wars, the threat of force, of using force, will not work as a mean to have good results. And that the only way to get results for Russia is to negotiate with European partners without using intimidation and force.
The EU's foreign policy chief has said that Russia is going through its most dangerous foreign policy period since the Cold War. You mentioned that France pretty much shares the views of Germany and other European countries. The United States and Germany met recently saying that Russia must be given a stern warning. But I'm just wondering, how do you convince somebody not to do something if they say they're not doing it? Russia has been adamant that what it's doing is for its own security concerns. It says that it has no intentions of attacking Kyiv.
The main argument the West is using with Russia is that the 8 years after Russia first invaded Ukraine and occupied Crimea and other areas in the eastern Ukraine, it fell under the Western sanctions, under US sanctions and under European sanctions. And despite these economic troubles, which it had after these sanctions were imposed 8 years ago, it continued its aggression. Right now, the message of the West is that the new sanctions would be much more severe. If Russia invades Ukraine, the new sanctions would destroy the Russian economic system. And the West is trying to communicate to Russia that destroying your economy is also not in our interest. Our interest is to continue economic cooperation. But this economic cooperation is impossible if you continue to behave in irresponsible way, if you continue to use military force or threat of military force as a mean of your diplomacy. So this is the main message. So stop intimidating us and we will continue cooperation. But if you continue intimidation, we will respond with very harsh economic measures. And of course, we will defend the other European countries, including Ukraine.
Just use Donbass as an example of why this is a delicate situation, and I say this against the backdrop of the repeated messages from Kyiv. Lisa says it's not interested in joining NATO, but it seems that Russia believes that that is a danger, as consistently says to NATO, don't admit, the Ukraine into the group. So why is Donbass emblematic of this conflict and how it can unfold?
Well, the Donbass is problematic to Russia because 8 years ago it invaded Donbass, but it failed to defeat Ukraine there. And right now we have a low-scale conflict in Donbass where Russia cannot prevail. So it just cannot prevail, and therefore it increases stakes in the conflict. Now it threatens with a full-scale invasion. And for instance, Macron, I think Macron will communicate to Russia that Europe is not going to include Ukraine into NATO, that Europe and the United States are not going to put sophisticated weapons in Ukraine to threaten Russia. They only would help Ukraine to defend itself against much more stronger Russia. This is the clear message. And just a few hours before our conversation, the State Secretary of the United States met with the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, Josep Borrell. And during this meeting, after this meeting, the American State Secretary Blinken said that Ukraine has already implemented all necessary steps for peace resolution in Donbass. The only side which hasn't done anything to stop the war in Donbass is Russia, and it's now Russia's turn to do the steps necessary for the peace in Donbass. So right now, I think the same message Macron is saying to Putin in Kremlin, the same message the United States are saying together with the representative of the European Union. So what is seen right now is that the West is united right now against Russia, but the West was not the side that started everything. Russia tries to threaten to the West, and the West consolidated. That was the major failure right now for Putin.
And this happens as the West continues to send troops, resources, personnel, and we're talking about military inventory to Poland. Just how strong is the force there? And this happens as there's news coming out of Russia that intercepted Russian intelligence says that that Russia cannot afford to have a war with the Ukraine, that there is doubt about this actually happening. Your thoughts about these two separate facts?
I think that right now we are seeing the consequences of this mistake, of this miscalculation, which was done by Kremlin. They did not expect this kind of huge response from the West. They expected that the West would be divided, that the certain Western countries like Germany or France or some other countries would start bargaining with Russia and trying to reach the separate deals, and would try to keep their privileged partnership with Russia, and that the West doesn't want that the West wants to avoid the conflict by any means. But in the last months, there are a lot of examples, and also these examples that you just said. These examples that the West really wants to avoid the conflict. But if it would be put to the red line, if Russia continue its aggressive actions, then the West would accept confrontation. But since the West is much more stronger economically and militarily, much more stronger than Russia, this confrontation could end in the collapse of Russian economy and collapse of Russian military. So really, and West doesn't want this collapse to happen because Russia is a nuclear power. And then it is a question, who will control the nuclear weapons in Russia if central government collapses? So this is really also one of the huge risks. And that is why the West tries to avoid confrontation. But at the same time, the Western message is clear. Message is very, very clear and precise. We do want to avoid confrontation, but if you continue to behave aggressively, we will respond also aggressively.
Okay, so we understand that the Chinese president has given his backing to Russia, if that's to believe that there was a meeting between the two, and the Chinese are certainly saying that they would, Chinese President Xi Jinping has backed his counterpart, saying that in a statement that they are calling out minority on the world stage for advocating unilateral approaches and what Russia has referred to as NATO aggression.
Well, yes, the Chinese voice is very important, but let's look to the facts. China supports Russia right now when Russia is on the verge of invasion, but still Russia has not done anything. Russia hasn't crossed the red line. Russia hasn't started the invasion, and Russia is not under sanctions right now. And in this situation, China would, of course, support Russia, but nobody knows, and I think even in Russia, nobody knows whether China will continue to support them if they start major war in Europe. Because starting major war in Europe, meaning that it would put the European markets in peril. And if China would join Russia in this conflict, that would mean that China is also expressing its hostile attitude toward Europe and the United States, which are very important Chinese markets. And I don't think that China is ready to sacrifice European and American markets just for the sake of Russian imperialism. I don't think that this is the matter for them.
The statement, though, says that they are committed to deepening back-to-back strategic cooperation. So you are saying that this is just posturing, it won't come to military cooperation, that China won't stand by Russia's side should it choose to invade Kyiv?
Yes, I think so, because China depends on the external markets. China depends on the sea routes. And that means that China depends on the partnership and cooperation with the West. China would confront the United States in the Pacific region, but also China depends on the American market and China depends on the European market. And China has a realistic view that it cannot break this Euro-Atlantic partnership, and that it cannot be hostile toward the main markets just for the sake of Russia. And just to explain to you, Russia exports to China, the Russian oil is just 14% of Chinese internal market, domestic market. And Russia controls only 11% of domestic natural gas market in China right now. And even despite the deals which were voiced during the recent meeting, new deals between Russian and Chinese companies, these market shares in oil and natural gas in China would not increase. So Russia is an important partner, but it's not vital partner in economic dimension. The more important partners for China are the European Union and the United States. And of course, Africa is very, very important. And if China becomes hostile toward the Western powers, like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, that would limit her influence in Africa, and that would make Chinese cooperation with African nations quite tense. So it's possible. I don't think it's possible that China would like to join Russia and start a major confrontation with the West right now.
No, Petro Burkovskiy, a senior fellow at the Kyiv-based Democratic Initiatives Foundation. This as a former Ukrainian diplomat and former assistant defense minister told an international news agent that it is wrong to talk about an invasion of the Ukraine because he says that they in the Ukraine have been under Russian aggression since 2014. That it's more correct to talk about a full-fledged or all-out war. Of course, we'll continue keeping our eye on developments on that story.